It's great to be here. Thanks again for having me, if I haven't said that already, sir. I am going to talk mostly about the Marine Raiders of World War II, but I will talk about other battles, other branches, and other units because they all are relevant to the story of the Raiders. So without having said that, I'll just go ahead and get right into it. So America enters World War II, everybody knows, on December 7th, 1941, thanks to the Japanese sneak attack at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, which was just a U.S. territory at the time. It had yet to achieve statehood, but it was attacked by what was called in Japanese, and forgive my pronunciation, the Kido Butai. It was a massive naval armada that was centered around 6 very modern, full-size aircraft carriers. And in what turned out to be the longest assault in military history, they sneaked right in and they hit the United States pretty hard at Pearl Harbor. And then, of course, at the very same time, they attacked Wake Island and Guam in the Pacific. The official date for the attack on Wake Island is December 8th. But being that Wake Island is on the other side of the international date line from Hawaii, it happened at the same time. Okay, so being that the attack on Pearl Harbor was a surprise attack, the United States military was not exactly prepared to enter into a global war. Now, by war's end, the United States was pretty much the only country in the entire world that was capable of prosecuting a war on a truly global level. But in December 1941, that simply was not the case. For example, Marine Corps schools Marine Corps schools published a manual called Amphibious Operations just as recently as 1935, which was only 6 years before Pearl Harbor happened. It was a comprehensive how-to manual of conducting a broad spectrum of amphibious operations, but the problem was none of it had been put into practice. And also on 7 December 1941, the Marine Corps numbered only a paltry 19,000. Now, before the middle of 1943, that number would swell to about 500,000, just to give you some perspective. But the Marine Corps numbering only 19,000 just really gives you a rough idea of just how unprepared the U.S. was in December 1941 to enter into a global war. Okay, so I'm going to move on and talk about key personalities, important personages in Raider history. And I figured what better place to start than right at the top. President Franklin D. Roosevelt himself. Of course, as you all know, he was the 32nd president. He served from 1933 to 1945. He passed away just a few months, I think, into his 4th term. So he had a comrade in arms, sort of a kindred spirit in British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who at that time was the United Kingdom at that time was really the only nation in Europe who was still standing up to the Nazis when every other country was intent on capitulating to the Nazis. And part of the reason why the UK was so stubbornly fighting this war against Nazi Germany was because they had the British commandos. Now, in 1940, I think we can all agree that the armed forces of the United Kingdom were nowhere near the levels or the competency levels, the numbers, the training, the equipment to go toe-to-toe against Adolf Hitler's Wehrmacht and the German armed forces. So it appeared that having the commandos, the UK having their commandos, was a viable alternative to set-piece pitched battles. They were small, they were lightly equipped, they moved fast, and they were highly trained. And so until the UK could get their conventional forces back up to par where they could go toe-to-toe against the Germans, really the commandos were the only viable alternative that they had. So along those same lines, FDR, President Roosevelt, he was close friends with a Marine lieutenant colonel by the name of Evans Carlson. For a few years in the 30s, Lieutenant Colonel Carlson, as a major, served as the executive officer of the Presidential Guard Detachment in Warm Springs, Georgia, and he and the president grew to be very close friends. And you may or may not know this, FDR's firstborn son, Jimmy, was also a Marine. He was a major, and he would eventually become a Marine Raider. Jimmy's initial assignment with the Raiders was as the executive officer of 2nd Marine Raider Battalion, and then later on in October 1942, Jimmy would become the commanding officer of the brand new 4th Raider Battalion. Okay, William J. Donovan. I'm sure that a lot of you folks are familiar with this man's name. So, Bill Donovan was a colonel in the United States Army. I think he was a regimental commander in France about 1918 time frame, where he gained fame and notoriety as a very aggressive and brave combat commander. And in the interwar years, he was a practicing attorney, had a lot of success there. And then in 1941, he was a senior advisor to the president on intelligence matters. He had direct access to the president. And he was also the what they call the director of information. And his organization evolved into what became the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. And of course, as we all know, the OSS eventually became the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, which is still in operation today. So he decided that the British commandos were a really good thing. You know, our counterparts in the UK really had something going over there. And so he drafted a formal recommendation to the president for the formation of a commando-like unit within the U.S. military. He was partially successful in that regard, as we know, but he didn't get to command it. Next, we're going to talk about Lieutenant Colonel Merritt A. Red Mike Edson. He was born in 1897 in Vermont. He enlisted in the Vermont National Guard at age 18 in the year 1915, I think it was. And he served for a little while in that capacity. And about the time that the United States became involved in World War I, he transitioned to the Marine Corps and earned a commission. And after World War I was over, he stayed in the Marine Corps. He kept his commission. And in 1922, he actually went to flight school. And he was an active Marine aviator for 5 years until 1927, when poor depth perception in his eyesight forced him back into the infantry. And he was also a crack marksman. He was on the Marine Corps rifle team for many, many years. He captained that squad to consecutive national championships in 1935 and 1936. And also as a lieutenant, he was on board the USS Denver, a Great War era light cruiser. He commanded the Marine detachment aboard that ship. About 1928, the Denver sailed down to Nicaragua. Colonel Edson and his Marines disembarked at that time. They spent 14 months in country fighting the guerrillas of one Augusto Sandino, I think his name was. And he gained a lot of experience fighting in the jungles in Nicaragua during that time. And that was during the so-called Banana Wars, which we're not going to get into right now because that falls outside the scope of the subject matter. But it's a great subject if you want to study it on your own time. And it was during his stay in Nicaragua where he earned the nickname Red Mike because of the beard that he liked to sport in the field. I don't know if you can see it here, but he's got a beard. He's wearing a beard in this photo. He's wearing a very sharp Marine Corps uniform and a beard, so kind of incongruous there, but there you have it. So he also he went to China in 1937 to Shanghai at the height of the Sino-Japanese War, and he had literally a front row seat to Japanese tactics and strategy, which would serve him well in the war to come. And he was handpicked to lead the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines in June 1941. Of course, 1-5, I will explain the evolution of how 1-5 became a Raider unit here shortly. Next, we're going to talk about Lieutenant Colonel Evans Fordyce Carlson. I like to think of him as sort of the yin to Edson's yang. They offset each other, I thought quite nicely. And by the way, that's Carlson on the right, in case anyone was confused. So, similar to Edson, he actually joined the Army early on, age 16. I think he was really young. He bluffed his way past recruiters. Like that's never happened before, right? And he was able to earn a commission. He was a battery commander for an artillery battery in the Army in World War I. But like Edson, he did not, when he got to France, the fighting was already over. So Evans Carlson did not see any action in World War I. But he transitioned to the Marine Corps in 1922 as an enlisted man, and shortly after that transitioned into the officer ranks for some reason. So that's kind of an interesting thing, because both Red Mike Edson and Evans Carlson, they were both enlisted and officers in the Army and in the Marine Corps. And similar to Edson, Carlson also went to flight school, but dissimilar to Edson, he failed right out. He went down to Nicaragua for a short time in 1930, got involved in a couple of skirmishes, and gained some valuable experience in the jungle. And like I mentioned just a few minutes ago, he was the executive officer of the Presidential Guard Detachment for a few years in the mid-1930s at Warm Springs, Georgia, for President Franklin D. Roosevelt, where he cultivated close professional and personal friendships with both the president and his son Jimmy. He did 3 tours in China, and it was his experiences in China, watching the Japanese and marching with the Chinese 8th Route Army. I'm pretty sure that's where that photograph comes from, was his time spent with the Chinese 8th Route Army. His time with the Chinese really informed his perspectives on so many things that lasted for the rest of his life. Not just strategy and tactics in war, but also political ideology and a sense of just a very magnified sense of community and teamwork. Matter of fact, he was so moved by his experiences in China that he actually resigned from the Marine Corps and wrote 2 books. Their titles I cannot recall off the top of my head, but I can certainly get that information to you at a later time if you want to hear it. Or you can just Google it yourself, whatever you want. So that's Edson and Carlson in a nutshell. And the next guy, I mentioned him already, but Major Jimmy Roosevelt. So he was FDR's oldest son. He was a staunch supporter of Carlson, both strategy, tactics, and ideology. They got along like 2 peas in a pod. And he initially served as Lieutenant Colonel Carlson's executive officer when 2nd Marine Raider Battalion stood up formally. And then in October 42, when the 4th Marine Raider stood up, he was appointed as that unit's commanding officer. Next we're going to talk about is Brigadier General Holland M. Howland Mad Smith. Interesting nickname. He got that because he wore his temper on his sleeve. Matter of fact, there was a story and he had this nickname for years before this incident that I'm about to describe to you, but in 1944 on Saipan, during the island hopping campaign, it was a combined Marine and Army operation. The Army unit was the 27th Infantry Division, commanded by General Ralph Smith, and it was Howland Mad Smith's impression that the 27th Division was not moving as quickly as they should, and so Howland Mad grabbed Ralph Smith by the collar, shoved him up against the tree, and told him to get the hell off his island. But Saipan was 1944. I'll go ahead and wind the calendar back to 1940. He was a brigadier general at the time. Brigadier is a one-star general. He commanded the 1st Marine Brigade, which got rechristened in 1941 as the 1st Marine Division, and it's still called the 1st Marine Division to this day, although it's commanded by somebody else. Okay, so a moment ago I talked about the amphibious doctrine manual that Marine Corps schools put out in 1935. Well, Smith faced the unenviable task of converting that paper doctrine into reality. And he would do that through implementing and carrying out these fleet landing exercises in the Caribbean, like in the summer of 1939, 1940. They were referred to as flexes, fleet landing exercises. And so he was able to, by means of carrying out these fleet landing exercises, he was able to identify potential problems with that paper doctrine and converting it into reality and devising solutions in order to deal with these problems and cultivate and refine amphibious doctrine until it was actually ready to go in a real world conflict. So one of the solutions that Howland Mad Smith decided on was these types of ships right here. The Navy called them APDs. Not really sure what those letters specifically stand for, but essentially they were high-speed destroyer transports. And when Pearl Harbor happened, the Navy had 6 of these, and then as the war progressed, they ended up converting, I think, 50 World War I destroyers into APDs. And it was a rather simple conversion process, for lack of a better way to say it. They basically went in, they took out, they removed all the stacks, because initially they were 4-stack destroyers. They removed all the stacks, they took out a couple of boilers, and what that created a huge cargo hold in midships, in the middle of the ship, which could accommodate a company of infantry. And the idea was that these high-speed destroyer transports, they would carry a company of Marine infantry just to within hundreds of yards of a hostile beach. The infantry would disembark via rubber boats and either use outboard motors or paddles to land on a hostile shore, disembark, and go off and do great things. And yes, the Raiders used APDs quite a bit during their time in the Pacific. Right, so early 1941, there was a sort of a composite unit that was temporarily thrown together for fleet landing exercise purposes called the Amphibious Force Atlantic Fleet. Holland Smith was its nominal commander, and it consisted of the 1st Marine Division and the U.S. Army's 1st Infantry Division. And they used APDs during these exercises quite a bit. And you see the photograph, the man standing to the left, all the way to the left in the pith helmet, that's Howland Mad Smith. The man next to him is Thomas Holcomb. He was the commandant of the Marine Corps at the time. And the man with the binoculars, looks like he's wearing a tie there, but I don't know who it is. But interestingly enough, the man on the far right holding his arm up and pointing, that's Teddy Roosevelt Jr. Not to muddy the waters with too many people named Roosevelt for this lecture, but Teddy Roosevelt Jr. was the son of the former president, and he was a career soldier. And Teddy Jr. died in Normandy, France in June 1944 from a battlefield heart attack. So back to Howland Mad Smith and the AFAF, the Amphibious Force Atlantic Fleet. He envisioned what he thought is like a 3-echelon concept. First, the APD battalion would go ashore, probably about 6 APDs, 6 companies of Marine infantry. They would go ashore, and in this example, they're seizing a key road intersection. And in Holland's mind, in a perfect world, they'd be assisted by parachutists. And then once those key terrain features are under friendly control, then the more ponderous main body would come ashore, followed up by your headquarters and support units. That's how Howland Mad Smith saw things going down with his 3-echelon concept. Okay, so Howland Mad Smith, he didn't want just any battalion to be his APD battalion. He wanted Lieutenant Colonel Edson's 1st Battalion, 5th Marines to be his APD battalion, which would go ashore by means of being transported by 6 different APDs. But fall 1941, at the conclusion of one of their exercises, the entire regiment goes back to New River, North Carolina. It's a Marine Corps air station now, but back then it was a newly established Marine base for training Marines to go to war. So Smith decided that he wanted to go ahead and keep 1-5 right there in Quantico, where it would become, some would ruefully refer to it as the plaything of headquarters. But suffice it to say, the regiment went back to New River, but 1-5 stayed in Quantico. And the APD was a good idea, but it had its limitations as well. It was fast, it could carry a decent amount of troops, but limitations of space meant that companies riding APDs had to be a little bit smaller than their counterparts in the standard Marine Infantry Battalion. And another limitation of the APDs was that they could neither embark nor offload any vehicles. So infantry that inserted into a mission via APDs had to carry everything on their backs into battle. No trucks, no support, just everything on your person or in your backpack. So we're getting to the kind of the good part. So I talked a little bit about this before. Wild Bill Donovan wrote a formal proposal to Franklin Roosevelt on 22 December 1941. I'm paraphrasing. He said, "Hey, Mr. President, we got to stand up a commando-like unit, and I think I should be the one to lead it." And so on 6 January 1942, excuse me, Howland Mad Smith appeals to the Commandant of the Marine Corps, saying that he wanted Edson's Infantry Battalion to be permanently attached to his outfit and separated from the 5th Marines. And so on 7 January, he gets his wish, and 1-5 becomes redesignated as the 1st separate battalion, meaning separate from its parent regiment. Right, so son James, Jimmy, he writes a letter to the Commandant of the Marine Corps voicing his enthusiastic endorsement of the idea of a commando-like unit or units operating in the Marine Corps. So 14 January 1942, General Holcomb, who, as we stated earlier, was the Commandant of the Marine Corps, he appealed to the senior generals in the United States Marine Corps, basically saying, "Hey, what do you think about William J. Donovan being the commander of this commando outfit we're thinking of standing up?" And the Marine Corps generals replied unanimously, "No, we don't want an outsider to lead this unit. We need somebody from within the Marine Corps." And so on 23 January, the Pacific Fleet of the Navy puts out an order that says, yes, we are going to accommodate the formation and execution of a commando-like raider unit. And so on February 4th, 1942, the Marine Corps stood up the 2nd Separate Battalion, and in order to provide a little bit of human startup capital for this battalion, 1st Separate Battalion sent about 1/3 of their number over to help with the manpower. So February has just barely started, and we've already got 2 battalions of Raiders. Because on 16 February, the 1st Separate Battalion got rechristened the 1st Raider Battalion, and on 19 February, the 2nd Separate Battalion followed suit. All right, so just as there were marked differences between Edson, the 1st Battalion commander, and Carlson, the commander of the 2nd Battalion, there were differences and similarities also between the battalions that they ran. Now, the 1st Raiders, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Edson, he was more conventional in comparison to Carlson, but they adopted an 8-man squad. Squad leader carrying a submachine gun, 2 automatic riflemen. The BAR was their automatic rifle of choice back in those days. It's called the Browning automatic rifle. It was thank you. It was essentially a 30-06 machine gun fed by a 20-round magazine. 4 riflemen carrying the 30-06 bolt-action M1903 Springfield rifle, and then a sniper or designated marksman carrying an 03 Springfield with a telescopic sight. And of course, Carlson opted for a 10-man squad that he could break down into 3-man fire teams, but carrying basically the same type of weapons except for a Thompson submachine gun instead of the inferior Rising, and instead of the 03 Springfield for his riflemen, they had the newer M1 Garand, which was a semi-automatic clip-fed 30-06 rifle. So being that the 1st Raiders were stationed in Quantico, they did a lot more amphibious training due to their proximity to the Potomac. And the 2nd Raiders, of course, because Carlson was so inculcated with the Chinese gung-ho philosophy. I don't know any Chinese, but apparently gung-ho loosely translates to working together. And his priority was to train his guys as a fast-moving, heavily trained guerrilla force. And both battalions, of course, they stressed a lot with hand-to-hand combat, marksmanship, and of course physical conditioning. And for all their differences, of course, they both of these battalions possessed a desire to excel in combat. And that's exactly what they would end up doing. All right, so April 42, the 1st Raiders get on a train on the East Coast and make their way to San Diego. They get on ships and they arrive in Samoa. Second Raiders get to Hawaii. And Admiral Nimitz and all of his, let me back up. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who was the commander of the Pacific Fleet of the time in the Navy, he thought that it would be a good idea to put a couple of companies of raiders on the Midway Islands because, I wrote Midway Islands. That's not a typo because if you look at Midway on a map, it's actually 2 different islands. There's Sand Island and East Island. Long story short, 2 companies of raiders ended up going to Midway on May 25th. And then when the Japanese attacked Midway Islands on June 4th, 1942, on the very first day of the Battle of Midway, the raiders helped with the static anti-air defense. And it was pretty inconsequential. I don't know if I don't know if the raiders were responsible for any of the shoot downs that the island's gunners had, but at the very least, none of them were hurt or none of the raiders were killed or wounded as a result of that 4 June Midway action. And just to give it some broader context here, so there was this battle called the Battle of the Coral Sea. It took place between May 4th and May 8th of 1942. It was off of Australia's northeast coast, south of New Guinea, in an area of the Pacific Ocean, obviously called the Coral Sea. Somewhat of a tactical draw because the Americans only sank what was classified as a light carrier, the Shoho, and the Japanese, in turn, sank a full-size fleet carrier, the USS Lexington. But strategically, it was an Allied advantage because it really hindered Japan's design on Australia, and it made the city of Port Moresby in New Guinea almost impossible to attack as a result of the Battle of the Coral Sea. And then, of course, the Battle of Midway is not really open for controversy at all. That was a resounding American triumph. The Americans managed to sink 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. 3 of those were in the span of 5 minutes, by the way, while losing only 1 of their own carriers, the USS Yorktown. And so now, at the end of the Battle of Midway, Japan no longer has the capacity to conduct offensive operations. Those days are gone. So what does that mean for the raiders? Well, you can kind of see the Solomons there, and you see the little name Guadalcanal pointing to that tiny little island. That was at the very southern boundary of the Japanese conquest up to that point. And so, in order for America to get on the offensive, take the initiative, get on the offensive, and completely turn the tide of this war, they had to start at the very edge and work their way in. And Guadalcanal ended up being the obvious choice. So a little bit closer view of Guadalcanal here. The 1st Marine Division landed on Guadalcanal on August 7th, 1942. And the 1st Raiders landed on Tulagi, which is a very tiny island just across the Sea Lark Channel from Guadalcanal. And they both landed on August 7th, 1942, and the American offensive was officially on. So when the 1st Raiders got to Tulagi, they landed at a place called Blue Beach because the invasion planners wisely concluded that there weren't going to be any defenders in that area, and they were right. Hydrographically, it was kind of difficult because they had to disembark from their landing craft and wade through the last 100 yards. But they skirted down the island, and as soon as they hit that phase line Alpha, they stopped for a little while, and they got some naval gunfire support to sort of soften up the hardened Japanese positions. And long story short, the Raiders settled matters on Tulagi in less than 3 days. There were 350 defenders on the island of Tulagi, and all but 3 were killed. And then eventually the 1st Raiders would make their way towards the larger island of Guadalcanal. So we're talking about the Macon raid. Now the Macon Atoll, and just in case anyone's confused about what an atoll is, it's basically a coral reef that surrounds a lagoon, and it looks like a little chain of islands on a map. So the powers that be selected Macon because its constituent islands, Butaritari and Little Macon, they were small, lightly defended. It was a good sort of starter raid for the raiders. The enemy garrison was estimated to be only about 45 defenders. Ended up being about twice that many, but it didn't matter in the end. So it was hoped that the Japanese would be so alarmed by this raid on Macon in the Gilbert Islands that they would divert precious resources and troops from Guadalcanal to Macon, thereby rendering Guadalcanal easier for the Americans to seize and control. and at the end of the day, it didn't quite work. But it was thought that a raid on Macon would be tailor-made for the raiders' originally conceived purpose, to be a small, highly trained, fast-moving guerrilla outfit that could just get in and out. Already talked about the hopeful diversion of the Japanese reinforcements from Guadalcanal, and also destroy the enemy garrison, equipment, supplies, installations, aircraft. It was thought to be a seaplane reconnaissance base, which it was. And of course, as always, they wanted to gain some intel on the area. So companies A and B of the 2nd Raider Battalion get the mission, and they leave Pearl Harbor, Hawaii on board 2 submarines. One company was on the Nautilus, the other was on the Argonaut. And their scheduled D-Day, departure day, would be 17 August for the island of Butari Tari, with a planning on Little Macon scheduled for August 18th. Now, Carlson wanted to leave Roosevelt behind because he was very conscious that this man was the president's son, and if he were to fall into Japanese hands, that would be a propaganda disaster for the United States. But it became essentially a grown-up version of, if you don't let me play, I'm going to tell my dad. And it worked. And it worked. Jimmy got to go. So they get to the objective area, and things kind of go not so great. The weather was a lot worse than they thought. It was really rainy. The seas were really choppy. And Carlson felt compelled to make last-minute changes to his plan. Instead of one company going ashore on one beach and another company going ashore on the other, he said, we're all going to go to the same beach. And the procedure for launching the boats from the subs was to be, they would just line up the inflatable boats on the top portion of the sub, and then the sub would slowly submerge, and then the rubber boats could just go be on their way. But that didn't work out. They had to lower equipment from the sub into the boats, and that didn't go well either because they lost a lot of ammo and equipment that way. And I call it Outboard Motor Appreciation Day because, being a former reconnaissance Marine myself, I've been in a Zodiac, I've been in a inflatable rubber boat, and I'd much rather have an outboard motor than paddles. But the Raiders didn't have that convenience. So there it is. Landing craft, rubber, large. You got the boat, paddles, and a bunch of different items that go with that boat. They couldn't use the outboard motors because the bad weather swamped all the motors, so they had to paddle in. Yeah, go ahead.
How many Marines are we talking about in this raid?
2 companies, so it's good. I think the exact number was 211 Marines. And so we know that Carlson decided to alter his plan at the very last minute. Well, as is standard with the way the military works, somebody didn't get the word. There was a lieutenant, he was a platoon commander in B Company. His name was Oscar Petros. I could not find a photo of him from 1942. This is the only photograph of him that I was able to find. This was as a Major General. This picture is from 1972. But anyway, he goes ashore with 11 Marines on his boat in what turned out to be the enemy rear area, alone and unafraid, and hundreds of yards away from the main body, with no way to contact Colonel Carlson or Major Roosevelt. But the main body got to the beach. They got there as fast as they could paddle. Once again, their outboard motors were not working. They'd lost a considerable amount of equipment already. And so what they did, they just hunkered down and waited for daylight. And so as daylight started to happen, or daylight started to creep over the horizon, they're getting ready to move, and a Marine from Company A has a negligent discharge, firing his .30-06 BAR into the air. So the element of any hope of catching the Japanese by surprise is completely gone at that point. But that didn't deter the raiders. They came there. They had a job to do. They said, let's just do our job. And so Alpha Company traversed the width of the island, which didn't take long because it was a skinny little island. And B Company followed them closely in trace as a reserve force. And so there is a little map of Butari Tari. You can kind of see where the most of the raiders landed there on the northern part of the island, and then hundreds of yards to the south, that other arrow represents where Oscar Petros and his men landed. And of course, on an island that small with that many gun-toting alpha males, they're going to get themselves into trouble. So, lead squad from Alpha Company, led by Sergeant Clyde Thomason, who would end up actually being awarded the Medal of Honor. They encountered sniper fire. So Thomason, what does he do? He doesn't take cover. He forces open the door of a small hut where the sniper was concealed, barges in and kills him. And his fellow Marines kill a bunch more enemy and continue to advance down the island. So another Marine spots an enemy truck and hits it with a Boys 55 caliber anti-tank rifle. Now, Boys was a brand name of a firearms manufacturer in the UK, and one of their guns was this big, huge 55 caliber anti-tank rifle that probably weighed 40 pounds. But it packed quite a punch. And so Japanese soldiers, they jump out of the truck and they engage, and they start returning fire to the Marines. And then after a while, more Japanese arrive on scene, and so now the raiders find themselves bogged down in a static firefight, which is not where they want it to be. And so they're wondering what they should do about the situation, because one thing about the raiders is that they don't want to be in one spot for very long. But turns out the Japanese sort of solved that problem for them, because the Japanese turned out to be even more impatient than the raiders. They went ahead and sounded a couple of different banzai charges. They just fixed their bayonets to their rifles, jumped out of cover, ran straight towards the Marines, and the Marines conveniently cut them down with rifle and machine gun fire. And the ones who didn't charge, the Japanese soldiers in this particular gunfight that didn't charge, the Marines were able to outflank and sort of destroy them, kill them on a sort of a one-by-one basis. And so, really early on in this operation, it's only 8 o'clock in the morning on day one, and already almost the entire Japanese garrison on that island is wiped out, although Carlson was not aware of that. So there was still a handful of soldiers left, of course, and some snipers. And Clyde Thomason, I guess the cost of his boldness was finally that he got hit by a sniper. He got hit by a sniper's bullet and he died. And after a while, he was posthumously awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. Of course, now it's just called the Medal of Honor. And there was a Fletcher-class destroyer, I think, that was commissioned in 1943 that bore his name. So Major Roosevelt is on the island while most of the other Marines are out there having a gunfight with the Japanese. But he sees that there was some Japanese shipping in the lagoon portion of the island. There's two sides to the island. There's the ocean side and the lagoon side. And there was a couple of small enemy craft on the lagoon side, and he summoned the submarines who were waiting offshore to surface, use their deck guns, and and open fire on these Japanese ships. So they did, and they were able to sink one gunboat and one troop transport. But there were some Japanese infiltrators who got close enough to attack the CP. The Marines manning the CP returned fire and drove off the attackers, but Jimmy Roosevelt was wounded in the process. Okay, Oscar Petros, the guy who landed in the wrong spot, the guy who didn't get the word, he's in the enemy rear with his 11 Marines, and he goes on an absolute rampage because his standard understanding was that if I'm out of contact with my CO, what am I going to do? Well, the CO's desired end state is this. He wants to destroy enemy. He wants to destroy equipment. He wants to gain intel, so that's what I'm going to do. And so him and the members of his boat, they destroy a truck, communication station, ammo. They kill the enemy, and one of the enemy they killed was the garrison commander. They burned down a building, but in so doing, he loses 3 raiders killed. And so he thought, okay, enough is enough. We're going to go ahead and retrograde back to the beach and try to get back to the submarines. And so the handful of enemy soldiers still alive, they call for aircraft, and a handful of fighters and dive bombers appear above the island. Carlson trained his men not to fire at the planes, so when they dropped their ordnance and when they went on their strafing runs, they did so blindly, and no raiders were even close to being hit by that. But there were two seaplanes that touched down in the lagoon, not too far from the burning wrecks of the ships that the raiders just destroyed. And Marines cut those down with machine gun fire, their rifles, and of course, their big 55 caliber anti-tank rifles. This is a stock photograph of one of the type of aircraft that the raiders destroyed, just a seaplane. And this is an actual photograph of the actual, this is a photograph of the actual seaplane that they destroyed. A big float plane, a big 4-engine float plane referred to as an Emily by American troops. And this photograph here is taken from 1943 when the U.S. Army landed a regiment on Butari Tari with the intention of seizure and long-term occupation. So those guys you see in the foreground there are probably from the Army's 165th Infantry Regiment. And so Evans Carlson, he's the battalion commander for the 2nd Raiders. He's coping with uncertainty because he doesn't know how many enemy soldiers are still left alive on this island, and he doesn't know how many reinforcements are coming. And so unfortunately, he had no idea that his raiders had already killed most of the Japanese on that island. But he wisely decides to withdraw from Butari Tari, go back to the subs, and then land on Little Macon the very next day. But Mother Nature said, I don't think so. So the last boat enters the water about 7:30 p.m., 1930s military time, not to insult anyone's intelligence. But the surf zone is unforgiving. Boats are capsizing, even though the raiders are trained to keep them from capsizing. They try to put as many men as possible in the front part of the boat to keep it from capsizing, but the surf zone was so unforgiving that that just wasn't effective anymore. But having said that, with the notion of try again, 7 boats actually did make it past the surf zone and make it back to the subs, whereas 120 raiders, most of the raider force that was on that operation had to go back to the beach. So we talked about when the raid started, they had already lost a bunch of equipment and ammo, and the motors didn't work. Well, during this particular attempt to get back to negotiate the surf zone and get back to the subs, they lost even more. So the 120 men that went back to the beach were demoralized, exhausted, thirsty, hungry, you name it. And so Carlson is faced with an even stronger dilemma, at least by his way of thinking. So he thinks, okay, they know we're here. They've probably got an overwhelming force on this island right now, and they're probably going to kill us all. So maybe we should just surrender. So what he does, is that he dispatches his operations officer and a Marine at about 3:30 in the morning of the 18th now to deliver the surrender overture. And so they do. These two Marines actually make a non-kinetic, non-violent contact with a Japanese soldier and hand him the surrender note in the hopes that the soldier would turn around and deliver that note to whoever the surviving Japanese powers that be were. But Carlson said, okay, I'm going to surrender, but if you still want to make it back to the subs, you can do that. So 4 more boats actually do penetrate the surf and get back with the subs, and Jimmy Roosevelt was among those 4 boats. So the Japanese would not be taking the president's son prisoner of war ever. And so what does Carlson do? So those 4 boats make it out, and with Jimmy Roosevelt on one of those 4 boats, but the 2 Marines he dispatched as the surrender party hadn't made it back yet, and so he just organizes patrols to see if they can go find any food or water and maybe ascertain some information about the current enemy situation. And so Marines end up encountering 2 enemy soldiers who they both kill, and it turns out that one of them was the guy with the surrender note, and they were able to come back. It was dawn now on 18 August, and the surrender party came back, and they were able to confirm that there was almost no opposition left on the island. And so Carlson, he said, that's great. That's a great weight off my shoulders. Let's go ahead and stick around for a few more minutes and to see if we can wreak any more havoc before we call it a day. So at about 9 o'clock in the morning there, somebody on one of the subs got the bright idea to put a boat into the water from the sub, dragging a rope all the way to the beach, and then using that rope to help the boats come back through the surf zone. Probably would have worked, but a Japanese Zero fighter patrolling overhead saw the attempt in progress and strafed the boat and killed everybody on board. So that plan was scrapped. So later in the morning of 18 August, they successfully contact the submarine, and they come up with another bright idea that they probably should have come up with before. They said, okay, well, why don't we bring the subs from the ocean side of the island back over around the other side on the lagoon side where there's no surf zone to hinder the evacuation efforts. And that's exactly what they did. And as it turned out, by 11 o'clock that night, 18 August 1942, all the raiders were accounted for and safely embarked on board the submarines, or so Carlson thought. And I'll get to that in just a moment. Okay, so the raiders get back to Pearl Harbor on August 26, 1942. The Nautilus and the Argonaut take them back to Pearl. Now, it was promoted as an unqualified success, and it was indeed at least a successful proof of concept that said, yes, the Marine Corps has the capability to have commando-like units that can conduct real-world operations. And Carlson became a hero. He earned a Navy Cross for his efforts on Macon. And in case anyone doesn't know what a Navy Cross is, it is an award that is second only to the Medal of Honor. And Jimmy Roosevelt also got a Navy Cross. Excuse me. And so, 2nd Battalion entered into a 2-month cycle of rest, recuperation, and training to get ready for their long patrol of November, December 1942, so just a few months later.
You want some more water?
Yeah, I'd love some. Kind of sounding hoarse up here. Perfect, thank you, sir. Okay, so talk a little bit about what the outcomes and the results were for the Macon raid. Talk about the pros first. They wiped out almost every Japanese soldier on the island. Okay, seaplanes and vessels destroyed, equipment, weapons, ammo, provisions destroyed, and they burned about 1,000 drums of aviation fuel. They gained some insight for Japanese fighting tactics, meaning that if the Japanese are bogged down too long in a firefight, they will grow impatient, they will fix bayonets, they will make a bugle call, and they will charge you. And of course, the Macon raid, the effect on the home front was that it increased popular support of the war effort. Okay, so the cons of the outcome of the Macon raid: the Japanese replaced their garrison just within days of the raid's conclusion. That's nothing that the raiders could have controlled. Did not affect Japan's designs on Guadalcanal. They correctly guessed the scope and purpose of the operation almost from the get-go. So strategically, it didn't affect the situation at all. Now, what it did, it convinced the Japanese to sort of reinforce and fortify their other island fortresses in the Pacific. And during the island hopping campaigns, they were very, thank you, sir. The Japanese fought with a fanaticism and a determination that was just incredibly difficult to overcome and defeat. And the bottom bullet point there, I wrote it in all caps with 2 exclamation points just to emphasize. It really was an utter catastrophe in personnel accountability. A couple slides ago, I alluded to the fact that the raiders were all accounted for, or so Carlson thought. This is what I'm getting at right here. The Macon 9. Okay, so there were 9 raiders. They were from Alpha and Bravo Company, completely abandoned and left behind on Macon. Yeah. So what happened is that the natives on Butari Tari, they were sympathetic and they were friendly to the American war effort against Japan. So they helped these 9 abandoned marooned raiders evade capture for a time. But that island is only so big. And the garrison is numbering quite a few by this time. So they decided to surrender, which they did on August 30th. The Japanese took the Marine raiders to Kwajalein in the Marshall Islands, where they were held for September, October, about 6 weeks. They were held there for about 6 weeks and then ceremonially beheaded. Koso Abe, who was the Japanese admiral that gave that fateful order, he was tried as a war criminal June 1947 and hanged. And also, just as an interesting historical aside, does everybody know who Louis Zamperini was? Unbroken. He was an Army pilot, spent time as a prisoner. Ironically, and I read this in a book called The Forgotten Raiders of 42 by Trip Wiles. Ironically, Louis Zamperini was the very first American to realize that Marines had been held prisoner on Kwajalein. Yeah. I talked a little bit about the natives of Butari Tari already. They helped the Marines with carrying ammo, provisions, wounded, and native islanders from all over the Pacific ended up helping the Marines and the Americans quite a bit, because the Americans came and asked for help, whereas the Japanese occupiers would come and brutalize and terrorize the indigenous populations, thereby ensuring that the natives of any given island on which World War II operations took place would side with the Americans. So the 18 raiders that were killed on Butari Tari, the natives actually buried them with reverence, and there they stayed until 1999, when the Marine Corps sent out a detachment to exhume those remains and rightfully, in my opinion, reinter those remains at Arlington National Cemetery. Okay, excuse me. All right, the next operation we're going to talk about is the raid on Tasimboko, which was a small village on the northern coast of Guadalcanal, a few miles east of Henderson Field. So we'll talk about the first raiders again. We just talked about the Macon raid, which was entirely a 2nd Marine Raider Battalion show. Transitioning now to talk again about first. So The first raiders conducted a patrol on tiny little Savo Island there to look for an enemy observation post. Didn't find one, but it was the APDs that took them there from Guadalcanal and also brought them back. So Red Mike planned. Red Mike, of course, Lieutenant Colonel Edson, he was the battalion commander for First Raiders. He planned a reconnaissance patrol for Cape Esperance the next day. It's on the very tip of Guadalcanal, because he wanted to know what a terminus might be for the so-called Tokyo Express, and I'll explain what that is on the next slide. But after the APDs dropped off the First Raiders companies from their patrol on Salvo Island, as soon as they dropped those raiders off, they went back out into the Sea Lark Channel there, which was now known as Iron Bottom Sound for obvious reasons. They were jumped by destroyers of the Tokyo Express and sunk. So Red Mike Edson got an intel update that said Cape Esperance is probably not the primary terminus for the Tokyo Express, but we think Tasimboko might be. And you might already know what the Tokyo Express is, but I'll get into that a little bit. So the Tokyo Express was the Allied nickname for the Japanese resupply of Guadalcanal. Resupply, reinforcements, anything the Japanese needed on Guadalcanal, it was the Tokyo Express that delivered it. And what they would do, they would set out from Bougainville or the Shortland Islands there, and they would wait for, and they would time it. They would sail down the sound. That part of the sound right there was called the slot. And just as darkness would fall, they would sneak in under the cover of darkness. They would drop off their troops, supplies, ammo, or what have you. And then they would turn around and go back up north through the channel before daylight came and aircraft from Henderson Field could interdict them. Anyway, that's the Tokyo Express there in a nutshell. And so what happened was that the Americans were convinced that Tasimboko was probably the point where the Tokyo Express was dropping off all of the Japanese reinforcements and resupplies. So they inserted at Taivu Point on Guadalcanal's north coast there and then worked their way to the west. And they tangle with a rear guard of about 300 soldiers just outside the village. They engage. And as has become routine at this point, they give a lot better than they got. They get into the village around noon, and they find just huge amounts of weapons, ammo, food, supplies. They even found about 500 life jackets lined up in nice little rows. And so not only that, but they also discovered maps and documents that were of substantial intelligence value, talking about the upcoming offensive that was going to take place in a few days. The upcoming Japanese offensive, which was going to be the Japanese attempt to retake Henderson Field. And so basically the raiders at Tasimboko, they basically stole what they could, and they destroyed what they couldn't take with them. And they estimated they killed about 50 enemy while only losing 2 friendly killed in action and 6 wounded. So adverse repercussions, of course. Adverse repercussions of Tasimboko action for the Japanese in that not only had the Americans gained valuable intelligence on the Japanese, but they also deprived them of a lot of provisions and supplies. And that would be very telling in the future, in the very near future. And I don't think I've mentioned Henderson Field before this slide, but you can kind of see on the map there, Henderson Field. So when the 1st Marine Division landed on Guadalcanal on August 7th, they basically drove the Japanese away because the only Japanese on Henderson Field on that day were the construction engineers that were actually putting the finishing touches on Henderson Field. So the Americans seized Henderson Field in very short order during the Guadalcanal campaign. And spoiler alert, the Japanese never got it back. So The next significant engagement for the Raiders on Guadalcanal, which was 1st Marine Raider Battalion, again, accompanied by the 1st Marine Parachute Battalion, which had helped them out in the Tulagi campaign, but they had the parachutist losses were far greater than that of the Raiders, and so the 1st Parachute Battalion was now really about the size of a company at this point. So General Alexander Vandegrift, who was the commander of the 1st Marine Division, just folded in the parachutists with the Raiders. And this is kind of what it looked like. You can kind of see, you can see Henderson Field on the map there. And just to the south of that, you might not be able to see it from where you're sitting, but it says Edson's Ridge. And that's where the battle was to take place. And so here's a photograph of here's an aerial photograph of Edson's Ridge, probably taken in mid-1942. This is taken from the south. The camera lens is pointing north. And you can kind of make out the very tip of Edson's Ridge there. And then in the distance where the jungle flattens out to flat ground, you can see Henderson Field off there to the left. And then all the way at the top of the photograph, that's part of Iron Bottom Sound. And here's just a close-up of Edson's Ridge there. They couldn't really dig fighting holes because, number one, they didn't really have good shovels, and they couldn't dig very far in any event because they would dig maybe a foot or two and then strike coral, which is basically just rock. And so why did Lieutenant Colonel Edson select that ridge as a key defensive point? Well, he has been fighting in the jungle for quite a bit. There was his experiences in Nicaragua during the Banana Wars, 1928 and 29. He had observed the Japanese in Shanghai. He had fought the Japanese in Tulagi. And he knew that in order for a night attack through the jungle to be successful, it had to move along a clearly defined avenue of approach. And for Edson, the ridge was the obvious choice. And as had become routine at this point, he was right as rain. And so they dig in. The Raiders and the parachutists dig in. They're reinforced by a couple of companies from 2-5, just south of the airfield. They've got 2 batteries of howitzers in support. And a battery is just artillery speak for company. So it's 8 guns, basically, they had in support. So a force of about 2,500 Japanese under the command of Lieutenant General Kawaguchi, they make their initial attack on September 12th at 2200. And I don't know how well versed you all are with military time, but that's 10 p.m., 10 o'clock at night. Keep in mind that the Raiders and the parachutists dug in on the ridge, they numbered fewer than 800. And so they were facing a force more than 3 times their size. So with the darkness and the thick jungle, the Japanese did find room to infiltrate between strong points. Their ferocity drove some of the Raiders back. But then daylight came, and the Japanese had made progress, but they withdrew to regroup and consolidate because they were a confused and jumbled mess. And the Raiders' counterattack didn't turn out to be disastrous because they didn't lose anybody, but it didn't really make any headway against the Japanese. So that was the first night on Edson's Ridge. So based on what had happened the previous day, Edson went ahead and pulled his forces back to the base of Hill 120 in front of his own command post. And to call it a command post is probably putting it a little too charitably, because I've seen photographs of Edson's command post, and it's a little indentation in the dirt about 2 feet. And that was it. Just standing there with a radio. Never took cover. And so again, just like the previous night, the Japanese must have had something they must have really liked the 10 o'clock hour. But they attacked the ridge again in force, and they pushed back the Raiders, they pushed back the parachutists, and sort of left Company B isolated by themselves in the front there. And so it kind of looks like with everybody, with the Americans withdrawing, you got Raiders pulling back over here, parachutists pulling back over here. They finally got Bravo Company back. It really started to look like the Japanese were forcing the Americans into a headlong retreat. And Edson, being the consummate combat leader that he was, he said, "Oh no, this is not working." I'm paraphrasing. And he's like, "No, nobody moves. Nobody goes anywhere. Just die in your holes." Very dire. And so the enemy comes back. And the Raiders initiated what they call final protective fires, FPF. FPF takes place when you are in a defensive position and you are sure that you're about to get overrun, so you unleash with everything you have. Every single machine gun that the Raiders had, they pulled the trigger and they didn't fire in 8 or 10 round bursts. They pulled the trigger and they kept on firing and they kept on firing. They threw grenades. They summoned artillery support, which was kind of a dangerous situation in a dangerous situation, because the shells were landing just within 50 yards of Raider positions. And of course, Edson's out there the whole time, just standing there directing the battle. There are little eruptions of dirt around his feet, bullets whizzing past his head, explosions everywhere, and he is just he is calm as a Hindu cow. So, in addition to the resurgence that the Raiders were feeling at this moment, also their attached parachutists sort of came together and launched a counterattack of their own, which was really helpful. And the renewed vigor on the part of the Raiders and the parachutists actually managed to push the line back out a little bit. And it was in the wee hours of the morning of the 14th that really defined how this battle would end. So Edson calls in a couple of reserve companies from 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines at about 4 o'clock in the morning. Kawaguchi doesn't want to give up. He wants to keep at it, but he's already lost hundreds of soldiers dead, and the ones he has left are just absolutely exhausted. He tries to send in 2 more attacks, but they're half-hearted, they're desultory, and they go nowhere. And then, of course, daylight comes. Daylight was the Americans' friend just as much as it was the Japanese enemy. So at 4 o'clock, when dawn breaks on the morning of 14 September 1942, on top of Edson's Ridge, the battle was effectively over. The Raiders and the Paras had won, but it was with a little bit of cost. This was by far the deadliest engagement that the Raiders had been in since the war started. They lost 135 killed, along with 128 parachute Marines who were already depleted from their previous actions on Tulagi. But the Japanese lost 700 killed and about 500 wounded, and that was that. Kawaguchi and his men sort of stumbled and staggered back into the jungle, dazed and confused, and they would be hunted down by Marines in the following days and killed. So Major General Vandegrift, again, he is the commander of the 1st Marine Division. He does a little reshuffling within the division. He identifies a few colonels that aren't really doing much of a job. He gets rid of them, and he takes Lieutenant Colonel Edson, promotes him to colonel, and makes him the commander of the 5th Marine Regiment. Lieutenant Colonel Samuel B. Griffith assumes command of the 1st Raiders just a few days after the Battle of Edson's Ridge. Okay, we talked about 1st Battalion on Edson's Ridge. We're going to talk about 2nd Battalion again. They had done the Macon patrol successfully, some would say, just a few months prior to this, but all 6 companies of 2nd Marine Raider Battalion ended up participating in this month-long patrol. So General Vandegrift orders the Raiders to move out from Aola Bay, where they just got dropped off, to harass and hunt down the enemy behind enemy lines. And the enemy attempts to ambush the raiders near the small village of Waco on 9 November, but it was unsuccessful, and the raiders killed 2 would-be ambushers with return fire. And so on 9 November, the raiders reached a small village of Binu, next to one of Guadalcanal's many, many rivers. That was 8 miles inland from the coast. And then Carlson's patrols, they contact Marine and Army units closing in on the main Japanese force. And on 10 November, companies B, D, and F, which was the other half of the other half of 2nd Raider Battalion strength, they land at Tasimboko and join up with the rest of the battalion. And by November 11th, there were 4 companies of raiders in the area of operations conducting their own independent patrols, with the exception of Company B, which stayed behind to guard the patrol base. So November 11th, Armistice Day. Raiders stumble onto an enemy bivouac site. So the initial exchange results in an indeterminate amount of enemy and 3 raiders killed. The raiders get pinned down by the Japanese responding to that threat. But then they manage to break contact under the cover of their own mortars, and thanks to a couple of P-400 Aero Cobra ground attack aircraft. And so the Japanese figure they've had enough with this particular engagement, so they withdraw, and the Marines occupy that freshly abandoned bivouac site. And so the rest of the Japanese in that immediate area didn't get the memo, so to speak. They keep coming back into this bivouac site thinking that they still own it. And so the raiders, as soon as they make contact with the Japanese soldiers coming back in twosies or fire teams, they're just killing Japanese soldiers as they come back in. And they managed to kill 25 Japanese like this without losing any friendly killed in action or wounded. But the raiders, it's in their nature to keep moving. If you stay in one place too long, that can never be good. So they went ahead and said, okay, we've killed 25 Japanese soldiers. Let's go ahead and quit while we're ahead. Let's move on. And so they did. On 14 November, they found another enemy outpost, and they killed 15 enemy soldiers again with no friendly casualties. So Carlson again moves his patrol base from the village of Binu to the small village of Asamama. And on November 17th, he gets orders from General Vandegrift himself to destroy a large enemy artillery piece that's in range of Henderson Field, and that is actually putting shells on Henderson Field and destroying aircraft and killing Americans. And so that's what they do. They set out from Asamama toward the Tenaru River for the next several days. So 25 November, the 2nd Raiders are out there tooling around in the jungle, and they discover a telephone wire on the ground. And so they pick it up, and they're like, where does this go to? And again, yet another enemy bivouac site. So they find a 75 millimeter gun and a 37 millimeter gun. The 75 millimeter might have been the one that Vandegrift sent them out to find. They sabotaged both of them by taking the firing pins out and destroying the firing mechanism so they wouldn't work. And so the advance guard of that particular patrol finds another camp with about 100 enemy occupying. So this is the biggest bivouac site that they've encountered this entire patrol so far. And the raiders, even though they were outnumbered by far, they had the advantage of surprise, and they also had the advantage of they had weapons in hand, whereas the Japanese they just had a very relaxed security posture. And what happened was the raiders killed 75 enemy, and the remaining 25 enemy just disappeared into the jungle. And again, no raiders were killed in that particular gunfight. And so they've been out there for almost a month by December 3rd, and Carlson's men are utterly exhausted. They've just had enough. They want to go back to the perimeter and get some food, get some rest, get some water. But Carlson, being the excellent, consummate combat leader that he was, he exhorts his men for one more effort. And so they go to Mount Austin, which is one of about 22 different peaks on the island of Guadalcanal. And they discover a well-entrenched yet unoccupied enemy position. And so they're looking around going, what's the deal here? And as soon as they lift their heads up, they notice an enemy platoon approaching that same site from the other direction. Again, the Raiders have the initiative. They have the element of surprise. They open fire and they kill 25 more Japanese soldiers. But they did not come away unscathed with that particular gunfire exchange. 4 Raiders got wounded, and one of them was so severe that he died later of his wounds. And so even Carlson has to admit that enough is enough. Let's call it a day, or in this case, let's call it a month. He wants to bring his Raiders back to the Marine perimeter. They get spotted by a squad of 7 enemy soldiers. They ambush Carlson and his Raiders, killing 4. But in the return fire, all 7 of the ambushers were killed. And the Marines finally enter friendly lines, and the long patrol is history. It is now 4 December 1942. The Battle of Guadalcanal is only 2 months from being over. So what was the results of the long patrol? Well, it was an extremely lopsided kill ratio, 488 enemy killed compared to, I can't really say only because I don't want to lessen the value of Marine lives, but it was a very lopsided casualty count, 488 Japanese soldiers compared to 16 Raiders killed and 18 wounded. And that was able to happen due to the excellent training that Carlson had given his Raiders in guerrilla tactics, and also the Japanese insouciance and carelessness they had when they're in their bivouac sites and they think that the Marines are miles and miles away. But Mother Nature, as it happened, was able to inflict on the Marines what the Japanese couldn't. They rendered 2nd Marine Raider Battalion ineffective because on that patrol there were dozens and dozens of Raiders that fell ill with malaria or dysentery, and the battalion would not see action again for 11 months on Bougainville in November 1943. So depleted were the 2nd Raiders from malaria and dysentery. And there's Carlson and his Raiders. That's probably a day or 2 after they re-entered friendly lines. They're showing off the spoils. Of course, they got a Japanese flag there and some weapons. Looks like they got a couple of Nambu machine guns, maybe. Exhausted but happy and victorious. Okay, so the Battle of Guadalcanal was effectively over in February 1943. And the Japanese abandoned Guadalcanal. There were about 2,000 soldiers left on Guadalcanal when the Japanese decided to evacuate. And they were more than happy to do that because nearly every Japanese soldier that set foot on Guadalcanal died on Guadalcanal. If it wasn't at the hands of U.S. Marines, it was because it was starvation or disease.
And should you mention there were no prisoners taken, right, for the most part?
Right. On Guadalcanal, the Raiders did not take any prisoners. Not because they were heartless or merciless, but just because the way the nature of their missions just did not allow for taking and processing prisoners of war. Good question, thank you. So looking at the larger picture, Guadalcanal lasted for about 6 months, from August 7th, 1942 to February 8th of 1943. The first couple of months of Guadalcanal were kind of touch and go. The Tokyo Express was running regular reinforcement runs. The Japanese were really giving a good account of themselves. And for a while there, the outcome of Guadalcanal was kind of in doubt. But February 1943, all doubt had vanished. Guadalcanal was a resounding victory for the Americans. And so, now that Guadalcanal was over, the Allied effort in the Pacific sort of coalesced into two major axes of advance. There was one in the Southwest Pacific that was commanded by General Douglas MacArthur with Admiral Bull Halsey as his deputy. And then there was the Central Pacific that was commanded by Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz. That came to be known as the Island Hopping Campaign. So, how did this major paradigm shift in the Pacific affect the Raiders? Well, they reshaped. September 20th, 1942, the 3rd Raider Battalion was stood up. Now, the 3rd Raider Battalion was unique compared to the other 3 battalions in that it was organized, equipped, and trained all entirely overseas. And Jimmy Roosevelt was its first CO. 1 month later, the 4th Raiders formed. No, I'm sorry. I need to go back a second. The 3rd Raider Battalion was actually commanded by Harry Liversedge. 4th Battalion formed on 23 October 42, and Jimmy Roosevelt commanded 4th Battalion.
Harry the Horse, right?
Harry the Horse, yeah, he was an Olympic shot putter. Yep. Big guy, big athletic guy.
He's a legend in the University of California. They have him in their Hall of Fame. He was a great athlete.
Yeah, I think I remember reading that somewhere. Yeah, just incredible. So February 1943, of course, Guadalcanal is over. All Raider battalions are in the South Pacific doing their thing. And also they had stood up a Marine Raider training center in California for training replacements to the Raider battalions. So 15 March, the Marine Corps in all its infinite wisdom decides to unite all 4 Raider battalions under now Colonel Harry the Horse Liversedge, and 3rd Battalion gets taken over by 1 Lieutenant Colonel Michael Curran. All right, so the Marines in general, and specifically the Raiders, they get attached to MacArthur's, let's say, axis of advance in the Southwest Pacific, which involves going up the rest of the Solomon Islands chain into Bougainville, into New Guinea, and the Philippines. And also the Bismarck Archipelago, New Britain. Kind of difficult to describe little tiny specks of island in the middle of a huge ocean. But the central intent with MacArthur's axis of advance was called Operation Cartwheel, which was not meant to attack the Japanese fortress at Rabaul on the island of New Britain. It was meant to isolate it by taking over key spots around Rabaul. And the Marine Raiders were attached to that. The Marine Raiders were attached to that particular effort. So, so for the rest of the war, the Marines and a lot of Marines in the Pacific ended up fighting for General Douglas MacArthur. And most of them were none too happy about that. So, New Georgia. This was done by the 1st and 4th Raiders from from 21 June to 1 July 1943. They occupied several different spots on the island of New Georgia and other islands within the New Georgia group, such as Wickham Anchorage, which was actually on the island of Vangunu, south of New Georgia. They forced the defenders to withdraw there. And then on the northern part of New Georgia, the 1st Raider Battalion and the Regiment HQ landed at Rice Anchorage on the north end of New Georgia. And before the enemy could really react, they took the Enogai Inlet and they set up an assault for Bairoko Harbor, which was just a couple miles down the coast. So 20 July 1943, it was a combined operation between the 1st Raider Battalion, 4th Raider Battalion, and a few battalions of Army infantry. They assaulted Bairoko Harbor. It didn't go so well because when the Raiders took Inogai Inlet, they had the advantage of surprise. But before Inogai capitulated, they managed to radio a warning to their comrades at Bairoko. And when the Marines and the Army soldiers came to Bairoko on the attack, the Japanese defenders were ready. And long story short, the Americans did not manage to take Bairoko with that particular effort. And 49 Raiders ended up getting killed and 200 wounded. Bairoko actually went down as really the only Raider operation of the entire war that did not succeed. So a little bit further up the Solomon Islands chain, you've got the island of Bougainville, which, if you look at any map, Bougainville is actually part of Papua New Guinea. But if I look at it on a map, it really looks like it's part of the Solomons. So that's my 2 cents worth on that. So while 1st and 4th Battalion were on New Georgia, 2nd and 3rd took care of Bougainville. They landed at Cape Torquay on Empress Augusta Bay on the island's west coast. And they fought in a number of very quick yet very violent engagements. Piva Forks, Numa Numa Trail, Coconut Grove. And actually, 2nd and 3rd Battalion were united and labeled as the 2nd Raider Regiment for this particular operation. So there were a lot of Army units on Bougainville at the time as well, but the Raiders certainly contributed to the overall success of the campaign, and they get the Americans one step closer to completely isolating the Japanese garrison at Rabaul, which they did. The Americans called it the wither on the vine strategy. It's isolating that garrison at Rabaul on New Britain, cutting it off from the outside world completely. So no resupply, no anything. It's like letting a orange wither on the vine. All right, so now we're talking about November 1943. It's getting a little bit later in the war. And so we are nearing the end of the Raiders. So a little bit ago, I talked about how both the United Kingdom and the United States had entered into war against their primary opponents without really having the conventional forces to go toe-to-toe with either the Nazis in Europe or the Japanese in the Pacific. So both the UK and the United States turned to commando-like units. The British had their commandos, the Marines had their Raiders. They turned to those units as viable alternatives to use while they built up their conventional forces. So now, at the end of 1943, the United States had projected just astonishing amounts of combat power into the Pacific. And so from a perspective of measuring the strength of America's conventional forces against Japan's conventional forces, the Americans were overwhelmingly powerful in that regard. So also in that regard, the Raiders were no longer necessary. And also, I talked about how after Pearl Harbor, when the Marine Corps only numbered 19,000 people, I talked about how by 1943 the ranks had swollen to 500,000, 500,000. Well, the Marine Corps wanted to go ahead and stand up two new divisions, the 5th Marine Division and the 6th Marine Division, but they had no designs on expanding their number past 500,000. So it became a bit of a zero-sum game at that point. They had to cannibalize specialty units, and the Raiders were one of those specialty units that got cannibalized, as were the parachute battalions, as were the barrage balloon detachments, as were defense battalions, you name it. After the Raiders were disbanded, they got rolled into most of them got rolled into the 6th Marine Division under the banner of the 4th Marine Regiment, which, as you may or may not know, completely ceased to exist when the Bataan and Corregidor fell in February 1942 in the Philippines. So from February 42 to February 44, the 4th Marine Regiment did not exist. But all of a sudden, when the Marines were standing up a brand new division, they waved their magic manpower wand and said, Ominous Dominus, the 4th Marines is now reconstituted from the Raiders. So most of the Raiders got folded into 4th Marines, which was under the 6th Marine Division, but personnel from the Marine Raider Training Center got farmed out to the 5th Marine Division. And the 5th Division was actually one of the outfits that landed on Iwo Jima. And it just so happens that 2 former Raiders were among the Iwo Jima flag raisers. I don't know if anyone knew that, but I just thought I'd throw that out there. The Marine Corps did 2 investigations pretty recently, one in 2016, one in 2019, and they were both spurred on by the work and the discoveries of just amateur historians who just wrote into the Marine Corps History Division and said, hey, I think you guys got your flag raisers wrong, and here's why. So long story short, 3 of the original flag raisers who America believed for decades were among that group actually were not in that group. And one of the ones that was shown to be among the flag raisers was a former Marine Raider, as was another one who was among the original bunch who made the cuts in 2016 and 2019. There was Mike Strank, and Michael Strank from 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines on top of Iwo Jima, and also a corporal by the name of Keller, who was also a flag raiser, also a former Raider. And a lot of these Raiders who served in the 4th Marines, who served in their new divisions after the Raiders disbanded, earned a host of medals for valor, to include the Navy Cross and the Congressional Medal of Honor, of which there were 8. A lot of people might tell you there were 7, but there were 7 Raiders who earned the Medal of Honor World War II. I say 8 because my criteria is if you were a Marine Raider in World War II and you earned the Medal of Honor, then you count in this list. The reason why some people say 7 and some people say 8 is because of one Army corporal by the name of Mitchell Red Cloud, a young Native American from Maryland, Wisconsin, who joined the Army in 1948, and it was on occupation duty in Japan with the 19th Regiment of the 24th Division. When hostilities broke out on the Korean Peninsula, his outfit went over there, and in November 1950, he was manning a listening post with a foxhole mate, and a lot of Chinese soldiers were headed in his direction. What does he do? He opens up with his BAR and fights and fights and fights until he is killed. He earned the medal, that young soldier earned the Medal of Honor for that action, and it just so happened that he was a former World War II Marine Raider. So that's why I say he counts. And a lot of, speaking of awards, a lot of, not a lot, but I think it was 21 Marine Raiders earned the Army Distinguished Service Cross on New Georgia because they were working for the ever-popular, I say that sarcastically, the ever-popular Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur's Marines, so instead of earning Navy Crosses, they earned Army DSCs. What else? Questions, comments, any sort of interaction I can have with anybody? I appreciate your questions and comments.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Hey, all the gratitude's on this side of the podium, believe me.